So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are absolutely thrilled to have you with us today. The following seminar is brought to you by nonprofit organization iExplore. We are dedicated to provide an extensive online study and communication platform for students around the world. We have over 80 teachers from multiple countries and over 500 students globally. iExplore provides free online classes and seminars to allow kids to learn and explore. In addition to this, our teachers encourage their students to harness creativity and develop critical thinking skills, allowing them to take their ideas to new heights, which is our motto here at iExplore through our innovative class curriculums. I am honored to be introducing our seminar presenter today, Devin Han. He will be introducing us to the world of coding through Repel. So Devin, you can take over.
Hello everyone, my name is Devin, and this is supposed to be our lesson 2 on the topic of web development. Last time we have talked about the idea of HTML and CSS and how it combined work together to create a beautiful web page. And today we're going to specifically focus on CSS and all the styling that comes with it. By the end of the lesson, you will have a solid grip on how to make kind of good looking style with CSS, and also how to animate the web with CSS animation and transition. So let's get started. I will switch to my main computer now. Can you guys hear me? What about now? All right. Okay. Now we should officially get started. So first, a little bit about me. My name is Devin Han, and I'm a student at Troy High School. I'm a 9th grader, but I'm going to 10th grade next year. This is me playing violin, and you should have seen this photo by now. I enjoy programming, visual art, and music, and I'm a member of the Troy robotic team, although I didn't contribute much really. This is my personal website if you want to pay me a visit. All right. Today we're going to cover really just 2 topics. One is CSS animation, and the other one is the idea of a block element and the margin, the positioning that comes with it. Before we go into animation, we have to make one point clear, that the web is based on 2 types of element. Now, an element is just, you should have heard of this term from our previous lesson. An element is just something that render a text, an image, or whatever. It's just whatever stuff is enclosed in HTML tag. And there are 2 types of element, if you generally say. The first, all right, I should disable the annotation. All right, but thanks for reminding me. There are 2 types of elements, and the first one is block element. The second one is inline element. We have introduced them from the last lesson. Now let's actually take a look at how they would actually work in the browser. I found this really good image explaining it on the internet. A block element would always take up the entire row. This image really tells it all. You take a look at this image, you see that we have 3 elements with red background, text of display block, and a black border around them. So we have 3 elements here. If I press right, annotation. Our element 1 element 2, and element 3. We have these 3 elements here. Notice how that the second element, instead of going to this white space here, right, as you think it would behave, it actually was rendered on a new line. And that's it. That's all about a block element. No matter how much space you take up, you will always occupy the entire line. And if you have an element after that, that's what the code might look like. We have first div, second div, third div. Div in this case is our element. And no matter how much space you take up, the second element, the element after you, will always start on a new line. Let me repeat that. Notice we have this one block element, and it only takes up half of the entire screen, right? But our second block element will start on a new line. And same applies for our third block element, which will always also start on a new line. That's really it. Fairly simple, right? And the vice is true for the inline element, where notice how this element will start immediately after this first element had finished. We have this first element here, display is inline, and it takes up about this much space of our entire window. The second element, if it's an inline element, it won't take up an entire row. It will start right next where the previous element had finished. Same applies for the third element here. Since this is also an inline element, it would start right after where the previous element had finished. As you can see, same HTML code with different CSS. One is display block, one is display inline, completely different result. When it's block, each element takes up one entire row. When it's inline, each element would start where the previous element had left off, had finished. This is just the code we have to write to achieve that effect. By the way, terrible naming here. Never name your element cool random block element. This is our CSS selector. I hope you remember this from the last lesson. With a dot, it means it is selecting a class. This is our CSS selector, and it is selecting an element that has the class cool random block element on it. It specifies a rule, display to block. That means that element will be display block. And for inline, almost the same thing, except here we have display set to inline. With this single line of code, we could achieve the effect that we have seen in the previous slide. Now let's take a closer look. This is the effect of block elements. Notice how they all take up a new line. They won't cram to each other. They will always start in a new row. And all the HTML elements have their default display tag. Even if we don't specify display block or display inline, they will have default elements. Those are the elements that by default are block elements, which means they will always start on a new line. We have div here. I forgot what div stands for, but it's usually used as a way to contain a bunch of elements. So div, you can interpret it as a container, div. P, which stands for paragraph. Back in the day of ancient computers, we can't just write the entire paragraph as tag here. That would take up too much memory, too much space. So we shorten it out and only write P. A P tag, which makes us a paragraph element. So that's the P tag we have here, paragraph tag. Notice it's, even though it's just this short and there's so much space, it will take up its own line. The second header tag, even though there's space here, even though there are space, the second header tag, this tag, which is this element right here, it will not start here. Instead, it will start in a new line. And that is because by default, all the header tag and paragraph tags are block elements. So we have H1 here, which is block, H2, and H3. I hope you enjoy my emoji here. All right, next slide. We have some tags that are by default inline, and those are span, strong, bold tag, strong HTML tag, and italicized. Modo, I am italicized tag. I don't really know how to pronounce Italian. And the effect is apparently very different. They are all on the same line, and that is the core difference. The reason they're on the same line is because that's both span element and strong element are by default in line. So it's true for the I element, which stands for italicized. All right, that is the end of our slide, and we should get started coding now. The coding tool that we're going to use is called Repel. The way you get it is go to our cool Google page, and if for some reason you cannot, or by do typing, oops, repel.com. All right, so alternative would be you typing repel.com on your search bar as a URL. Repel.it. This will bring you to this page, and if you're new here, let me just show you how to register an account. You click on sign up. Use your Google, GitHub, or Facebook, or maybe just create your own account. I'm just going to sign up using my Google. And now you should be in this page. After you're in this page, click on New Repo. Notice you have the language tag prompt out for you. They support HTML. They will actually cloud host your website after compiled. So name it lesson 2 blog animation and more. Well, I don't know if there's more. So blog and animation and more. And now you should have this boilerplate code generated. I will wait for a few seconds for you guys to catch up. Remember, you would go to your repo. Let me just show you how to do it again. You type in repo.it. You either log in or click on Start Coding. I'm going to log in. It will bring you to the dashboard page. On the dashboard page, click on My Repo. It's here, this button. This button, My Repo. Click on it. And it will bring you to this repo page, and you should click on New Repo to start a new repository. Select HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and name your repo, and then just click on Create. So you should have this boilerplate generated for you by Repel. We already introduced what this boilerplate does from our previous lesson, so we won't waste any more time on this. First thing we're gonna do is to recreate this kind of box. And remember that I said earlier, some elements that are default block elements are div, paragraph, h1, h2, and h3, and much more. And for our purpose, we're going to use div simply because that's the most common way you would use to create some kind of block-looking element. So, code alone, in our body tag, we would write div and I will copy this 3 times. This doesn't actually do anything, notice here. This is just our text that we want to display on the browser window. This don't actually change our CSS. And let's give it class block. Class just allow you to select it in your CSS later on. Again, you should have noticed from the previous lesson. So, all right. In our CSS, we would write dot block, since dot is the selector that you will use to select a block element. Or sorry, a selector that you will use to select an element by its class name. And since we have given this a class name of block, we will select it by using dot block. Here we got this selected. We would make background color to red. Instantaneous, you can see the change reflected. By default, a block element will take up the entire width of the screen. And that's by default. Its width is always gonna be the entire width of the screen by default. We can override that rule by writing our own width. Maybe 100 pixel. Now you can see our width is no longer that crazy long. So we override it with width. Third thing that we're going to do is to make our block element higher. By default, each block element height will be defined by how many rows of text there are. So right now, our height is just this high, right? And the height is simply the height of our text. Inside here, we only have 1 row of text, so our block element, our div here, will only be 1 row high. But we could overwrite that with height 500 pixel. Now you see we have this gigantic element here that is really large and not limited to the height of our text. There's a problem if you want to deal with this, which is text overflow. So if you have specified a really short width, a really short height, like 1 pixel, you will encounter text overflow. Text overflow simply means that your text is actually too big to be contained by your container. This container, in this case, is our block element, this div here, and the text is simply the text inside of the div. So overflow in this case just means this text here is too big to be contained by our block container here. Why is it too big? That's because we specify height to 1 pixel only. To deal with overflow, you specify the overflow property. In this case, we can do overflow set to hidden. And that will just hide whatever element that's overflowed. Notice how you can see all the black text had disappeared. again, let me remove overflow to hidden. And you can see that instantaneously, the text that is too big to be contained, the overflow text, which are those, are being displayed again. And if we don't want it to be displayed, since the text is technically outside of our tiny container, and if we don't actually want it to be displayed, we can do overflow to hidden. Makes sense, right? Since our text is overflowing and we put overflow to hidden, that means our text would be hidden. All right. That's the effect we have. I'm going to specify some kind of height for it. All right, that's what we wanted. Comparing to this here, it has a black border. The way we achieve a black border is through border. And we simply write border 5 pixel solid black. This is a shorthand writing separated by space. The first one specify how wide the border should be. The second one, solid, specify the styling of the border, which we had talked about last lesson. The third one is just the color of the border. So remember, width, style, and color of a border. And here we have this, I guess it's recreated from this element here. Of course, we also want to squeeze the element on the second line. So we might as well just do width to 80. And text. And use text overflow. Actually, that wouldn't be necessary. All right. So we now have this block element here. And it pretty much looks like what we have in our slide. And now we should be able to do some animations stuff with it. Notice how we have this element and we're setting its width value, right? We have this width of 70 here right now. And if we were to change it to a different value, of course, our width will grow larger. Our width will grow larger. And that is all because we had changed the width value here. Now, how would we actually try to animate it? Well, the idea is that we have this width property here, and it is a numerical value. That means somehow we could change it frame by frame from a higher value to a lower value, and therefore creating an illusion of movement. So by this, I mean, really, in our browser, we have to tell the browser, as the first frame, we would do width to 60, and the next frame, 61, third frame, 62, and then 63, and eventually we render it every frame, and then we change it to width to 100. And by rendering that process, we have created an illusion of movement. So that's the idea. Let's first set it to width equals to 10. And how would it actually tell the browser to render the process from growing this box width beginning at 10 to width of 100? That's the effect we want to achieve, making the box size starting from 10 grow from 100. There's two ways. The first way is not really outdated, but not that clean to implement either. It's called Keyframe. And the second way you can achieve an animation is called transition. We're going to, of course, first look at a keyframe. It's much more straightforward than transition. The way you do a keyframe animation is that you will have to define a keyframe. A keyframe, simply put, is you specify two value, and it will automatically have rendered all the interval value depending on the timing function you give it. I might be speaking alien language to you right now if you don't understand. That's perfectly fine. Keyframe. If you had any experience with animation before, you might know this term keyframing. It's perfectly fine. If you don't, let me show you what it is. We will do keyframe. Notice we have this at here. Who's making the noise? I'm gonna mute everybody, so. All right, if you have a question, you feel free to unmute yourself. This simply tells the CSS to create a new keyframe, and we can tell them overflow. Oh, you cannot unmute yourself? Well. All right, so.
If you have a question, just type it out in the chat section. So if you don't want to if you don't want everyone to see it, you can privately type it to either me or I Explore Club.
Thank you. All right, so I will just unmute everyone now. Thank you for explaining. The way we define a keyframe is fairly simple. Let me first do it, and then you can see the process. We have width, and it will start at 10 pixel, and it will end at 100 pixel. So we have 0% here and 100%. What does those percentage actually mean? Well, they actually mean the timeline from the start to the finish of this process of this entire animation. So 0% mean time 0, where the animation had just started. And 100% means that the animation is just finished. So by this, we're telling the browser. Now, I really wish you can see my camera here. So I'm doing some crazy kind of hand motion here. But by this, we're basically telling the browser that at the start, we want our width to be 10 pixel. And by the time this animation had ended, we want it to be 100 pixel. That's it. The browser, by default, will interpret it as a linear interpolation. What does that mean? Well, linear interpolation just means every single unit of time, it will add a single unit of pixel. Now, that means at time 1%, the width might be something like 11%. Now, that is of course incorrect, but something along that line. If you're interested, look up linear interpolation formula. It's just a mathematical formula. Just here, and it will just transitions. You take you take the difference between this and this, which is 90, and I think you divided by 100%, somewhat whatever, and every percentage you add like 1% of that. So every second you add 1% and something along that line. But you get the idea. It's just this is a linear way of transitioning from 0% to from 10 pixel to 100 pixel, and in its interval, it's gonna grow linearly. So if you have learned linear function, great. This is exactly what is happening right now. Almost, although not exactly, but you get the point. Where at 0%, it will be at width 10. At 100%, which by the time the animation had finished, it will be at width 100 pixel. And between those times, the browser will render the process of transitioning to that through a linear way. That's the default timing function. Remember that vocabulary? Timing function. A linear interpolation is a timing function. And the reason that you see so many other, like, oh, Google doesn't have an animation for that, sorry. But the reason you see other cooler, bouncier, or eased out animation, those bouncier animation, those ease in, ease out animation, the reason you see those is because they have implemented different timing function. And if you want just a linear way of moving objects, transitioning the property, the default linear interpolation is the way to go. So we have the keyframe defined, and to apply this on this block element, we would write animation. Oh, hopefully I remember this. I usually would look up a documentation. All right, time to see. All right, okay. So you would write animation, your keyframe name, how long it should last, and this will be put into account for your linear interpolation. This will be how you specify the animation should be. In this case, it's linear, which is our old friend linear interpolation. Now, of course, if you specified only 1 second, your animation will be played much faster because you will always reach 100%. I mean, 100 pixel by the end of your animation. And that means the browser had to play much faster to catch up the speed. And that's because it implemented the formula of linear interpolation. And there's also other functions you could use, other timing functions. Like for example, easing is out. You see this kind of bounciness, although not quite obvious. The reason they work is they're implementing something called Bezier curve. And if you're interested, look it up. It's also another mathematical formula stuff. Not really a formula, but and it allows for kind of curve instead of a linear calculation of value, a growth or decaying of value. We have easing is out, which is pretty descriptive. The animation will come easing in and also easing out, and the speed will eventually catch up and then slow down. For our purpose, let's just use linear, a constant growing speed. I hope you all enjoy this cool little fun animation. Let's see what other properties that we could animate with the web. There's actually a tons of cool stuff. Opacity, which is specially optimized for animation. The width property isn't that optimized for browser-based animation, but opacity is actually optimized. That means it will run fast, it will run smoother, and have less impact on your CPU and computer. So we're going to do this in our keyframe. In our keyframe, we already specified an animation for width. Let's also do it for opacity. Opacity is a percentage value from 0 to 1. 0 means is completely invisible, and 1 means is completely visible. That by now you have noticed that we could just write the styling here exactly as CSS. We could specify as many as property as we wanted, as many property as we wanted. And they will be applied to our current element at that position of time, at that percentage. And they will be animated. So we have this opacity one. All right, now this is getting interesting. You see that it started being invisible, and then as the time progressed, it's eventually revealing itself to the audience. You could try playing around with it. There are a ton of animatable CSS property. Almost all the property that has a numerical value could be animated. Even color can, because you know color is just a hexadecimal code and which represent numerical values. So let's say we want to transition from red to blue. By doing so, we need to first remove red from our background color. Or we don't really need to do that, since animation will override our default styling. This is called a styling. Those are all styling, and styling applied by animation will override the styling we had without animation. So inside here, let's just change it color. I want to change the color from red to blue and also animate it. You should try it on your own too. Let me give you 10 seconds to figure this out. And after that, let's see how it works. All right, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. All right, 10 seconds is up. Have you figured it out? Now, if you have, please paste your code in the comment section so you can flex on your fellow student. Hello, Jack. If you have figured it out, please post it in comment section. Or did I disable the comment? All right, since nobody wants to share, I'm just going to show you how to do it. In here, we would write background color, red. And here, we would override it with background color set to blue. It's that simple. And the browser will eventually first start as red and eventually morph off our color to blue. So you can see this cool effect where it started off as red, but then eventually turned to blue. Now, notice how after the animation had finished, the color turned back to red. Why is that? Well, that is actually because we had this default color to red here, and while animation is being played, those styling are applied to our object, our element. And that is why when the animation is being played, it's eventually changing from red to blue. But immediately after the animation had finished, this will be removed. This styling here will be removed from our element. And this will kick in and it will say, huh, animation finished, let's change back to red. To get around with it, we could remove the default. Actually, I don't think we could do. To get around it with, we can do infinite, which just loop our animation. All right. So we had this morphing, cool looking little animation here. And our class had lasted 40 minutes. I'm going to show you really quickly how do you apply animation by transition. It's almost the same idea, except you don't do keyframing. Now let's remove this animation from, remember that I have said earlier that we have another way of doing animation for our element. And that other way that I mentioned is transition. So instead of writing animation, we are now going to write transition. The way we do it is actually transition. And I'm going to not set it for now, since I'm going to first code the transition. Very simple. We make a new class. We set the background color to blue. And notice what we do. We give this, what is it called? Block blue. We give this block blue class to the div element here. Notice how you can actually give two classes to a single element. The way you do this is by just putting a space in between, and now you have two classes apply to the same element. That means both the selector could select the same class. Same element. So the block selector could select this. The block blue selector, this class selector, could also select this element. So now both of these styles here are going to be applied to our element here. Of course, we haven't finished the transition. Let's just see what will happen. Notice that all the other element with only block class is rendered red. And that is because we told them to be red in our block class. And our first element here with both block class and block blue will be rendered blue. And that is because this comes later than this in our CSS file and will have a much higher priority. That means this will be overriding this. This will be applied and this will not. If we inspect element here, you can see that, if I could make just bigger by annotating, you can see that this is actually crossed out, this line here for our blue element. This is crossed out and it is being overridden by this blue here. And actually by doing two elements, we could use a transition to have a nice little transition between them. The way we do it, we first tell them what property we should have transition on. In this case, we wanted morph from red to blue, so we choose background color as our transition target. And second parameter, I believe, is time. Third parameter is our linear interpolation function. We tell them as linear. Specify. Oops. All right. I have to look up the doc. This is pretty interesting. Let me see how this. All right, apparently, if you have this class immediately overriding your initial class, immediately overriding it, it won't affect anything. The way you do it is either using JavaScript to add this class during runtime to let it override it, or you could use some kind of pseudo selector called block. This pseudo selector will select this element when it is being hovered and apply all those styling to that element when it's being hovered. Yeah. So notice here that we have this transition set. This is just all for transitionable element. And the timing is 3 seconds. So initially it started as red, and then when we hover over it, it became blue. And because we have a transition here, it won't actually immediately turn to blue. The process of letting this blue overriding this red will cause a transition here. So that's why we have this smooth transition. And the advantage you can see that is that when we're transitioning back, it is also very smooth. And that is because when we are no longer hovering this element, this is being stop applied. This is no longer being applied to our element. This hover selector here is no longer being applied, and background color red kick back in. And because there are a transition, it will smooth in and smooth out. If we don't actually put a transition here, it's gonna be instant. That's the difference. Hover select the element when being hovered, so that's why this is working. And if we put transition here, you can see the difference here. We have transition, and you see, as the name suggests, we get a transition. And if we don't have a transition, as the not name, but as it shows, we don't have a transition. We could, of course, transit other elements. Let's just say width. Because we're going to use width all the time. Notice here, this select the element when being hovered and apply those styling. So that is why when we hover over this element here, its width will grow to 300 pixel, and its background color will immediately change to blue. And if you don't want this sudden change, get a transition. So transition all 3 seconds, the timing, and that's it. Notice here it's growing eventually, and we're kind of having a little cool kind of animation here, I guess. And that will be it for today's lesson. You're welcome to play around with the code here. You can, of course, animate all kind of elements you want. Let's say border. When we're being hovered, we want our border to grow really large. I'm not sure if border is animatable. Let's just see. Grow really large and change the border to white. All right, nice. Border is animatable. So we have this kind of artistic effect here. I notice on my screen it's really laggy, so I hope you can actually see the transition that is being played. I will make this 10 seconds long, so it will take very long to transition, so you can actually see the transition. All right. Yes, of course, I can put the code in chat. So to actually see this code, it's very easy. That's why I love Repel. You could just copy and paste this link and put it into your own window. I have posted the code link to the chat. So if you go to chat, you should see a link, and that's why I love Repel. After you open the link, it will direct you to my repository, and you can just click run and play around with it. And as soon as you start editing, it will open a new repository for you. All you have to do is take this link and put it into your browser. And now you will go to my repository, and as soon as you start editing, it will overwrite my repository and create a new one for you. So you're free to play around with it. That's it for today's lesson. Hopefully you learned something from this terrible lecturer here. And see you next lesson. That's it. So you can take it back, Emily.
Okay, so a big thank you to Devin for so patiently guiding us through such a detailed process of creating our own little animation, and also explaining the key concepts behind the scenes and reasons why and how we get to our final outcome. So I'm sure everyone took something away from that. We will be hosting more seminars in the future like this one. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have more questions, feel free to contact us either through the WeChat or our website, and we will be directing you to Devin, who will be answering your questions. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you again in our next seminar. Bye, guys.